Saturday, everyone. Isn't the conference going amazingly well? I'm learning so much that I have pages of notes already. And today I'm delighted to introduce a wonderful author, our Saturday keynote speaker, Xio Axelrod. Xio Axelrod is a USA Today bestselling indie author, an award-winning singer and songwriter, and a passionate advocate for romance fiction. She writes what she likes to call strange, twisted tales. A completely unapologetic, badge-wearing, fic-writing fangirl, Xio finds inspiration in everything around her. From her quirky neighbors to the lyrics of whatever song she currently has on repeat to the latest clips from her favorite TV series, Scum, Xio weaves her passions into her books. And if you're curious about Scum, ask her about it. Just be prepared to settle in for the long haul. Xio grew up in the recording industry and began performing at a very young age. As a result, her knowledge of popular music is nearly encyclopedic. Seriously, look her up on quiz night. She might even be up for some karaoke. Xio is a former voting member of the Recording Academy and loves Grammy season because she always discovers great new artists. A 2018 recipient of the RWA Service Award, Xio is quick to step in where needed. When she isn't working on the next story or advocacy project, she can be found behind the mic in a studio, writing songs in her bedroom-turned recording booth, or performing on international stages under a different, not-so-secret name. Xio lives in complete denial of the last 5 minutes of Buffy with one very patient, full-time indoor husband and several part-time, supremely pampered outdoor cats. Her print debut is expected from Sourcebooks in early 2021. Please welcome Xio Axelrod.
Hi. When RWA invited me to be one of the keynote speakers for this year's virtual conference, my first instinct was to decline, for myriad reasons, not the least of which is the enormity of the moment we find ourselves living in. Surely there were more accomplished, more compelling, infinitely more eloquent people out there with truly inspiring things to say. I could name several of them off the top of my head right now. But I recognized the invitation as the privilege it was. And I said yes. And then I immediately went into panic mode. Who am I and what do I have to say that anyone would want to hear? And who cares about my story? As the queen of procrastination, I promptly put off thinking about it. Maybe the speech would somehow magically write itself, I thought. You know, that's the way it works with books, right? The truth is, my thoughts are hardly original. Treat people with respect, make room at the table, open your mind to other voices, etc. Nothing that hasn't been said again and again and again. But then one day, I was watching Hamilton. You may not be familiar with it, but it was big on something called Broadway. I'm told that's a place that people used to go to see live theater. Imagine that. I watched it from the comfort of my sofa on my television. And there's a song at the end, the 46th song in the show, if I remember, called Who Lives, Who Dies, and Who Tells Your Story. And as someone who makes a living writing stories, it really made me think about who gets to tell their story and whose story gets told. I grew up in Philadelphia. We're known for our fanatical devotion to our sports teams, but despite what you may think you know, Philly is also a mecca for the arts and for education. Anyone who knows a place like this or grew up in a place like this with such a rich history probably understands what it's like. Field trips to old buildings where people did stuff that didn't mean a lot to you as a fourth grader, but it's a day away from the classroom, so woo! And as you can imagine, the Revolutionary War was a big deal here. As a kid, you learn all about the city's role in the creation of this new nation. You visit Independence Hall and see the surprisingly boring room in which the Declaration of Independence was drafted. You visit Ben Franklin's print shop and the first post office. Turns out Philly is home to a lot of American firsts. The first zoo in the U.S. was in Philadelphia. The first bank, the first insurance company, but also the first paper mill, the first public school. And I spent a good portion of my formative years wandering through the halls of world-renowned museums and combing through the stacks in the country's first public library, surrounded by monuments to the foundation of the United States. There were stories, so many stories. Stories about George Washington and William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania, and Thomas Jefferson and John Hancock, and I learned all of these names, who these men were, and what they contributed. Ben Franklin looms large above them all here because this is Philly, and a guy still wanders the streets dressed like him, and people address him as Mr. Franklin or Ben. He's a pretty cool guy. But these great men shaped our fledgling nation, I was told. Oh, and some woman named Betsy allegedly sewed a flag, and you can visit her house and look at her rocking chair. As an adult, I came across names I hadn't heard in all of those history lessons. Crispus Attucks, the runaway slave who found work as a sailor and a rope maker, considered the first man to die for our revolution. Maybe it's because it happened in Boston that I didn't hear about it, because Philly and Boston, it's a thing. I stumbled upon the story of Phyllis Wheatley, the political poet who used her words to fight for the revolution. In 1773, she became the first African American and the third woman ever to publish a book of poetry in the United States. I didn't even know her name until a few years ago. And I wondered why. Why was that? I know why. But still, I wondered. Maybe it was the Boston thing again. As a kid, I barely heard anything about world-famous Philadelphian and contralto Marian Anderson, who was turned away from Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the Revolution when she wanted to perform there in 1939. She ended up singing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and when faced with performing for a crowd of 75,000 people, Marian famously said, "I could not run away from this situation. If I had anything to offer, it would have to do so now." Talk about a call to action. Here's the thing, though, and keep in mind, I went to a pretty progressive primary school, so you'd think I'd have heard at least a few of these stories of courage and bravery that shaped us as a nation. But stories reflect the storyteller. Stories only resonate, perpetuate when they're given voice. And we know not all of our voices have been reflected in our history or in our culture, which means our story is incomplete. It's been filtered through a specific lens, distilled into a Cliff's Note version that omits more details than it conveys. It's why we know the names of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but not Ida B. Wells or Harriet Fortin Purvis. It's why before the 2016 book and film Hidden Figures, most of us didn't know anything about Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, or Mary Jackson. Storytellers have so much power. They not only frame our history, they often rewrite it. Alexander Hamilton is the hero in Lin-Manuel's show, but there's so much more to his story. Despite that, I have no doubt the show will color the way he is viewed for the rest of time, for better or for worse. In the early 2000s, I was trying to find my path in the music industry, playing a lot of open mics and busking on the weekends. I'm a rock girl, but my brother was an aspiring hip-hop and soul producer. He had composed a track he really loved and asked if I'd write lyrics for it. It was our first collaboration. And it wasn't a bad song, if I do say so myself. In fact, we got some airplay on a local station, Power 99 FM, and we were even interviewed on air. It was a really big deal. But the real coup was scoring an invitation to headline at the Black Lily. Now, if you're not familiar with it, the Black Lily was a weekly music showcase that started in New York and eventually moved down to Philly. It was started by two women, Mercedes Martinez and Tracy Moore. Some of you may remember them as the Jazzy Fat Nasties. They're awesome. If you don't know them, look them up. But they wanted to give opportunities to female musicians and vocalists who weren't welcome in other spaces. The Black Lily was the place to be if you wanted to get noticed. And it wasn't uncommon to find celebrities in the crowd. Sometimes members of the Roots would sit in as the house band. And as the story goes, Jill Scott and Macy Gray got their big breaks during the Black Lily performances. I remember watching a 13-year-old Jasmine Sullivan blow us all away. She was going to be a star. We all knew it. We saw it happening before our eyes. And artists like Janet Jackson and India Arie and Alicia Keys, you should just pop in and perform every now and then. Anyway, I'm name dropping. The organizers had heard our one little song on the radio and invited us to come perform. I think it was supposed to be 2 or 3 songs set, but like I said, it was a really big deal. The night of our showcase, we were all super nervous. We told everyone we knew to come and pack the house. The 5 spot where the Black Lily was held was not really big. It didn't even have a proper stage. It was a real bar, but they set the front of the bar up as like the stage for everyone, and you were kind of eye level with the crowd. We wanted to fill it with our friends, so make us look really good. As the night went on, and it got closer and closer to our time, we kept having to pump ourselves up because no telling who might be in the audience that night. It could be our big break. But just before our slot, which was supposed to be the final one of the night, we were pulled aside. We have a special guest, they told us. They're going to do one song, and then you can go on. We all looked at the time and wondered how that was going to work, because the club was closing in 20 minutes or so, and it was barely enough time for one act to perform, let alone 2. Sorry, they said, special guest just came in. All right, so we slunk back to our corner, and the host called someone up to the stage named Susan Jones. I'll never forget this. She was this tiny Black woman in a big floppy hat and big baggy clothes. And she immediately launched into a song that we all knew, we all recognized. And I can't really remember what song it was, but it was very popular at the time, so people were singing along, heads were bopping. And being a type of open mic showcase, it wasn't uncommon for people to do songs that the crowd knew. It got them, jazzed up for your performance. At one point, though, I realized this wasn't some random singer doing a cover of a popular song. It was the voice. I knew that voice. And then in the middle of her performance, very dramatic, she ripped off her big floppy hat and revealed a freshly shaven head and an unmistakable face. And I watched the crowd as recognition slowly filtered through them, and then they lost their minds when they realized who it was. As for us, we were in shock. I mean, how are we supposed to follow this, person that everyone knew and everyone loved? She performed one song as promised, but it lasted for like 10 minutes. And it was wonderful. It was magical. It was an amazing moment. I'm glad I was in the room for it. But when she left the stage, she took all the magic with her. So much so that the club started turning on the lights to get the people to leave and telling them it was, last call or whatever. And people started filtering out. We had to remind them that we were the headliners for the night and that we were supposed to go on. And they said, oh, yeah, okay. Well, you can do one song. So we did our big song, but there were only a handful of people left. Our moment was gone. That was the end of our story. Heartbreaking, isn't it? But I tell that story often, but just not in the way that I just told it to you. Instead, I usually put a little spin on it. I try to shine a positive light on what happened. And I do so by asking, have I ever told you about the time Erykah Badu opened for me? Totally different perspective, right? It's the storyteller's perspective that informs us. Representation matters. I'm sure you've heard that phrase many times, especially in the course of our discussions about race and sexuality and neuronormativity and gender and how it's positioned within romance. Representation, though, isn't just about tokenism. It's about reflection. It's about perspective. It's about holding up a mirror and seeing our society as a whole, complete picture. Because when we fail to do that, we do ourselves a disservice. All of us, not just the communities we neglect. We deny ourselves the privilege of knowing who we are, really, as a nation, and more than that, as humankind. It's all about the story. Who tells it, who consumes it, whose story gets told, and how it gets told. What we write, what we read, what we buy, review, acquire, publish, and shelve, all of it informs our collective view of the world and of ourselves. So when we tell the same stories in the same way, with the same archetypes over and over, we do ourselves a disservice. When the stories are monolithic, we're doing ourselves and our readers a disservice. Romance is such a subversive genre. That was the first thing I learned when I joined this business seven years ago. We're always challenging the status quo. always fighting for agency and voice, but for whom? It hasn't always been for everyone, not even in the short time that I've been here. Our fight, our story has been incomplete. And an incomplete story is setting a TV show in a place like Manhattan and somehow never showing a character of color, or even, showing a group of people walking by. It sounds absurd, but someone who has never been to New York might not know how absurd that is. If they've watched every episode of their favorite series, they might think they have an accurate picture of the city. You could tell them that there are Black and brown and Asian people all over Manhattan, but they've seen Friends, and they've seen Sex and the City and Gossip Girl and Seinfeld, so you must be wrong. Is it their fault for not looking a little deeper? Yeah, of course it is. But they've still been done a disservice by the story, shown an incomplete story. Incomplete and untold stories have subverted our entire reality. The incomplete story we have of Regency England has had no room for the untold story of people like Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III, or Dido Elizabeth Bell. Because we only get excerpts of our own history, we end up with alternative facts where people feel justified in, say, publicly questioning an author about the existence of Latin Americans in Europe in the 19th century. Confident in their knowledge that there weren't any, or very many, not realizing the story they've been told is incomplete. As creators and consumers of story, we owe it to ourselves to dig deeper. We need to challenge what we think we know. Many of us have failed to do that. Women, people of color, the LGBTQ+ community, the differently abled, so many have been excluded from the narrative. So many voices. Just think of what we're missing. It shouldn't take a global movement to end racism for people to realize there are incredible books written by Black authors, portraying all the different shades of the Black experience. We shouldn't wait until Hispanic History Month to discover all the talented Latinx authors who are penning stories steeped in culture, history, and tradition. And it shouldn't take Pride Month for us to remember that love is love and that there are hundreds of authors writing books that celebrate that. The romance industry has spent decades training its readers in what to look for in our genre. Decades. What to expect from our stories. And if you Google romance novels and look at the covers, you'll see exactly what that is. So I say this to you. If you're an agent, a librarian, a bookseller, a blogger, a reviewer, an acquiring editor, and especially to the publishers, it's time to retrain your brain. And in turn, those are the people that you influence, because it doesn't sell, just won't fly anymore. We've proven that. The world is hungry for more voices, for more stories, for a more complete story of us. And it's time we tell it. Thank you, RWA, for having me. I hope everyone stays safe and healthy and that the rest of 2020 is a bit kinder than the first part has been. And to all my fellow Americans, for the sake of us all, please vote.